Well, hi there. Ollie Anderson here. You're listening to Creative Status. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Thank you so much. This is a place where we talk about the human condition, what it means to be a real human being, how we can move towards wholeness, the level of ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, the relationship that we have with other people, the relationship that we have with life itself, and how we can kind of travel through the world, keeping this idea of wholeness in mind so that we can keep evolving, we can keep growing, we can live the best possible life and create something real while we're here. This is another solo episodes. If you are new, traditionally this has been an interview podcast. The last few episodes have all been solo episodes where it's just me. I am going to keep doing interviews, but I'm only really going to do it now if it's something that super hypes me up. That isn't to kind of besmirch any of the guests I've already interviewed, but just so that I can bring more energy into these conversations and just really, really share the most value possible. I guess what I'm saying is it's going to be about quality, not quantity. So anyway, today's episode is going to be short, hopefully. I want to talk about clarity or confusion and how we can bring more clarity into our lives. The reason that I want to talk about this is clarity is something that I see people searching for when they come to my coaching practice, when they initially reach out for coaching. It's a very, very common problem. It's a word that people often use, clarity. And the reason that so many people are looking for it, I believe, is because the world is confused. The people that make up the world are confused. And I want to explore how that happens, what we can do about it, and how we can bring more clarity into our lives so that we can move forward, we can take actions that actually matter to us, and we can kind of flow instead of forcing or keep banging our heads against a brick wall because we're distracting ourselves or because we just don't have a direction or we don't know what we're doing or we're just running on autopilot, going into old conditioning and scripts and all that stuff. So ultimately, it's going to be a short episode, but we're going to look at that clarity or confusion, where this confusion that holds people back comes from, what you can do about it, and how you can move forward in your own life. So we've already set up a kind of dichotomy here between clarity on one hand, confusion on the other. Clarity, as you can probably guess if you've listened to me talk before, it's something that I think is very real. And then the confusion is unreal in the sense that it's unnecessary. We don't need to be confused. The main thing that you can take away from this episode right at the start is that if you are confused, you're living in a confused state about life in general, not about some specific problem that you're trying to figure out, just life in general, then there's a very high chance that, surprise, surprise, because this is a major theme of this podcast and everything I talk about, you become disconnected from yourself at the level of your own realness, your own connection to the truth, wholeness. When that happens, we end up creating a false version of ourselves, which I often call the ego. And when we end up identifying with the ego, we send all of the very real parts of ourselves that need to be expressed so that we can get clarity in life. We send them into the shadow territory. They get sent into exile in the shadow self. When this happens, we end up filtering everything that we do through this fragmented ego version of ourselves. And on a long enough timeline, if we continue to make choices from that place, from a fragmented relationship with ourselves, then our lives become increasingly fragmented. The goals that we're chasing for ourselves, for example, become a reflection of the disconnection within ourselves, which is often one of the core motivations that is causing us to chase the goals that we have in the first place. But because those goals are motivated by the fragmentation, they just end up exacerbating the problem and making things worse, which adds more confusion. If we are fragmented in this way that I'm talking about, then our emotional relationship with ourselves isn't allowing us to feel what we need to feel, and so we become confused about what's actually going on inside us and who we really are. etc, etc. If everything that we do is filtered through this fragmentation, then we become ultimately more confused because we're adding more and more complexity, unnecessary complexity to our lives, and it just brings more noise that distorts the pure signal of wholeness that is already within us. And so ultimately, going from confusion to clarity is about breaking away from all of that noise and returning to the natural signal that is already within us in this metaphor that I'm using. And that is just our realness, the connection to wholeness that we already have. So that's the context within which I'm framing this kind of dichotomy of clarity or confusion. Confusion is where we're living in such a way where we're just bringing more noise into our lives because we're fragmented. Noise is all of the self-limiting beliefs, all of the emotional stagnation, all of the things that we do to distract ourselves from that inner split and disconnection in the first place. So when we're just doing all these time-wasting activities, like, I don't know, like binge watching Netflix when we don't really want to be doing it, we just don't know what else to do because we've become detached from our purpose, or we're just getting engaged in empty relationships with people because it's better alone than in, we forgot that it's better to be alone than in bad company because, again, we want to distract ourselves, etc., etc., etc. We can spend our whole lives just bringing noise into the equation that does not need to be there and that just blocks the signal. And so going from confusion to clarity is really just about listening and retuning in to the signal that is already there. And that signal is just wholeness. So with all of these solo episodes, there's 3 takeaways that I want to get you to take away from what you're listening to. So I'm going to blast through these now in relation to the confusion or clarity thing. The first takeaway is this. So I don't know if you want to write this down. I don't know how people take these things away. Make a mental note. But the first one is ultimately it comes down to choice. Confusion or clarity ultimately is a product of the choices that you've been making. And it boils down to whether or not, surprise, surprise, you're choosing either wholeness or fragmentation within each moment. If you continue to choose fragmentation because of the core motivation being to run away from yourself, because of the inner split that we talked about between the ego and the shadow, and the shame that often drives that dance between the two. If you keep choosing fragmentation, then on a long enough timeline, you're ultimately going to end up confused. The reason being that the gulf between who you think you are and your real self is going to get wider and wider and wider. But also, you're going to choose things to cope with that disconnection. So all of the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago, like distracting ourselves with Netflix or empty relationships or food or whatever it is, those distractions are usually just a coping mechanism for being fragmented in the first place. But they add all of this unnecessary extra complexity that just makes the confusion much, much worse. And then if you do that for long enough, you end up in a situation where you look around you and your life does not feel like yours. You feel like you need to change things, but you don't know where to start because there's all these different levels of confusion and complexity and distraction and so on and so forth. And you just become overwhelmed. You don't know where to start. And so that is the first takeaway. That if you found yourself in the situation where you do feel like you need clarity, you need to understand that the reason you got there in the first place is because you were choosing a fragmented relationship with yourself. That fragmented your relationship with other people by extension, and it fragmented your relationship with life. And when you add all that together, you just end up with this kind of hodgepodge of different coping mechanisms and different goals that aren't real goals or that aren't aligned with your real values and intentions, and you feel confused. And it's all because you've been choosing the ego over the shadow self, ultimately, which if you are in this situation, confused in general with life, not just confused about a specific thing that may be confusing, like how to solve a creative problem or something. Well, if you've ended up in that situation, well, it's because you've been making habitual choices for fragmentation. And so part of the way back home, part of the way back to clarity is to start changing those habitual choices. Normally when I'm coaching people, it starts by figuring out a vision, breaking it down into goals, breaking it down into habits. The last episode of this podcast was about creating a very real morning routine that can start to align you with the version of yourself that you want to become, your real self. Things like that are how you rewire and reconfigure your unconscious relationship with yourself. Because if you are confused in this way that we're talking about, you're ultimately working in such a way where your unconscious mind, the unconscious habits that drive you, are constantly getting you to choose that fragmentation instead of wholeness. So that's the first point, the first takeaway. The choices that you made will either lead to clarity or confusion. And if you want to find clarity, then you need to start making the choice for wholeness and undo the damage, so to speak, that has been done by acting on autopilot because of the ego shadow dance and choosing fragmentation consistently over time, which always leads to confusion. So the first takeaway was that if you end up in this situation where you're confused with life in general, then it's a consequence of the choices that you have made. The second takeaway is what happens if you keep making these choices. And this is really just to let you know that ultimately we're all constantly on a sort of turning point. The choices that we make right now, i.e. today, moving forward in life from this moment, ultimately are going to affect our future. And so if we are in a place where we're confused, listening to this podcast, and we continue to keep making the same choices for fragmentation, then 5-10 years down the line, things are ultimately just going to either be the same and we'll still be confused, or they'll be worse because we've just added more and more levels of complexity and confusion and limitation and fear to our experience of life. And so ultimately, this is just a very short, sweet takeaway. And it's that if you want to change your life and you do feel confused, then you need to really think about how things are going to be if you don't start making the kind of choices that I'm talking about right now for wholeness and realness over the fragmentary stuff that's confused you and is currently holding you back, if you are in the situation. And ultimately, what that means is starting to think about the kind of life you want to live, the kind of person that you want to be, and the path that you see yourself predominantly being on as you move forward. If you can imagine just doing the things that you're doing now, being the person you're being, thinking the way you think, doing the things you do, if you don't change any of that stuff and you project forward, are you happy? Or are you just going to be more confused? Then it's time to start choosing wholeness over fragmentation. If you can see some light and you can see that the future could be better, then there's a very high chance that it's because you're either introducing some wholeness into the equation or you're getting ready to do so, which means you're going to finally start acting on the real things within you that are starting to emerge and that are calling for you to act on them in the first place. So that was a short and sweet takeaway, but it's ultimately that the choices you make, the first takeaway was the choices you make led you to where you are, but that also means that the choices you start making moving forward will either lead you where you don't want to be or where you do want to be. And that all ultimately comes down to you and this choice that we can make in any moment for either fragmentation and the same old bullshit or wholeness and something real. The third and final takeaway is that if you want to start moving towards clarity and to overcome confusion, then you kind of need to change the way that you've been thinking and acting, to state the obvious. And I've already kind of said, well, did say in fact, that this is about making the choice for wholeness over fragmentation. But the third takeaway is that the best way to do that in relation to clarity is to be one-minded in your approach. This just means you need to focus on just one thing. Often, almost always in fact, when we've become confused in this fragmented way that we're talking about, it's because we're choosing a million different things at once. We don't have a vision for ourselves, so we're not directing everything towards that. We often don't have goals. We often don't have habits. We're just kind of willy-nilly moving through life, hoping that things are going to work out, doing the best that we can, which is amazing. But because there's no fundamental structure and because we're running away from ourselves with all of this fragmentation and distraction and bullshit, then we end up just doing so many different things at once. And that all just ends up making things more confused, sucking us deeper and deeper into the void and making us more and more fragmented because there's no unity really between the choices that we're making. The third takeaway is really simple, but it's to just find one real thing. That's all you need initially to start moving towards clarity. You don't need a billion different things to start fixing your life. You just need one real thing. And the good news is that if you stop and you reflect and you look at yourself and you look at your life, this one thing is already going to be emerging at some level. It might just be a very broad picture. It might be very nebulous, but there is something that is trying to emerge in your life. And if you act on it, it's going to bring more clarity, because whatever this one thing is, it's real. It's something that is coming from your unconscious and is trying to make itself conscious. And if you stop blocking it with all the fragmentation and distraction and confusion, or believing that you're confused, then you're going to allow it to surface, and you're going to be able to take action based on that one thing. And then when you do that, the next one thing is going to emerge, and then the next one thing, and then the next one thing. When you focus on just one thing, when you really concentrate on it, all of these problems of duality and complexity and fragmentation fade away. They kind of dissolve. And that's because your mind is being given something to focus on. The reason that we end up confused in this way that we're talking about and choosing fragmentation instead of wholeness is because our minds are not under our control. They're basically not mastered. And so they end up leading us wherever they want to go. You've probably heard the expression about the monkey mind and how it hops from one place to another, one branch to another. If you don't have mastery of your mind, then that's ultimately what happens with the choices that you make. And so you choose one unreal thing and then another and another and another, given on what's going on inside you. And so if you can focus on just one real thing, it might be a creative project, it might be a conversation that you need to have, it might be something that you want to express in the world through like music or whatever. It might be taking up a new hobby like yoga or whatever, like literally just one thing that is real to you. If you focus on that, then you're going to bring more clarity into your life, because first of all, you're going to give your mind something to focus on, which is going to remove a lot of the confusion, but you're also going to be acting on something real, which means that you're going to start taking steps towards wholeness, which is going to kind of remedy some of the effects of this fragmentation that has caused you to be confused in the first place. So that was a really quick kind of episode for me anyway, about confusion and clarity. The 3 takeaways are very simple. If you become confused about life in general, and you don't know what direction you're moving in, and you don't know who you are anymore and all that stuff, then it's because you've been choosing fragmentation over wholeness. You've been filtering everything through ego, and you've been blocking the expression of your real self, normally because of unresolved shame, guilt and trauma, which we didn't talk about in this episode, and your fear of finding out who you really are. So that's the first takeaway, that is because of the choices you've been making. The second takeaway is that now you know this, you're on a bit of a turning point, and if you project forwards and imagine how life is going to be based on the way that you're thinking, feeling, being, and making choices right now, you'll know if you're on the path to more fragmentation or towards wholeness. The third takeaway is that it's not complicated to start putting yourself back on the path to clarity. It's just about finding one thing, literally one thing that is real to you, and then acting on that and using that to carry you forward. That's going to master your mind, because it's going to give you something real to focus on, but also it's going to direct the actions that you take and allow you to get results that are aligned with wholeness, not fragmentation. So if you want to make this practical, it's kind of obvious what you need to do. You need to sit down and you need to figure out what that one real thing is. What is one real thing that is calling out to you right now? What is emerging from your shadow self that is trying to present itself to the surface of your life so that your real life can surface? Your real life, for most of us, is hiding in the shadows. That's why it's always about awareness, acceptance, and action. And so if you can find that one thing, figure out what that one thing is, and then do it, start acting on it, then life is going to become a little less confusing, because that one thing will always bring more clarity. So that was a podcast. Hope it helped you. Hope it made sense. Hope you find that one thing. If you want to learn more about transformation in general for realness, I've got a free PDF that you can download on my website. Just go to ollyanderson.co.uk/ego shadow trust. That's the name of the PDF. It walks you through the process of awareness, acceptance, and action. If you want to book a call with me to figure out what that one thing might be for you, you can do that on my website as well. It's a free call initially. Go to ollyanderson.co.uk/talk. Either way, stay real out there. Find peace by walking that real path. And I hope this helped you. Peace to you.